This is my week 14 food preservation scientific method project, and it's a study on how to keep food tasty. This project will follow the steps of the scientific method, and we talked a little bit about that in class. And so, what is the scientific method? It is first and foremost a process of discovery. You make an observation. From that observation, you formulate a question, which turns into a hypothesis. That hypothesis turns into a prediction, and then you do an experiment. And from your experiment, you get results. And from your results, then you can make a theory or keep doing more experiments. And this is used in all sciences, including chemistry, physics, geology, biology, and psychology. This study will follow the process of the scientific method to solve an everyday problem. Right, so what's our problem? Well, we've got a lot of problems happening concurrently. One big problem that we have is this COVID-19 and the pandemic it it has led to an increase in panic buying, stockpiling of food, meat, produce, dry goods, other household items and things, and not going to the grocery store as many times per week. So normally I make several trips a week to the grocery store. We also eat out a lot, and so I only buy what I need for the next couple of days to prevent food spoilage in our house. And like many other Americans, COVID-19 has changed my shopping patterns. So we like to eat a balanced diet containing lots of fruits and vegetables. Problem with that being that fruits and vegetables are highly perishable foods. They are subject to rapid deterioration by microorganisms and enzymes or oxidation reactions, and simply put, when food isn't eaten or preserved, it goes bad. And so this is both a personal problem and a global one. This is a quote from a source: "The global food systems make significant contributions to climate change greenhouse gas emissions, with all stages in the supply chain involved, from agricultural production through processing, distribution, retailing, home food preparation, and waste all playing a part. This gives rise to other major environmental impacts, including biodiversity loss and water extraction and the pollution of lands. If food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter, right after China and the United States. So when we're talking about water extraction, 25% of the fresh water is consumed for farming, and 1 billion people are malnourished, while 150,000 tons of food are wasted each day. Think about that. And 24 million acres of land is deforested for these purposes. So this obviously contributes to food inequality both locally and globally. Well, so what causes our food to spoil? For fresh foods, the primary quality changes occur as a result of bacteria or fungi growth, resulting in pH changes, formation of toxic compounds, off odors, gas, and slime. Yum. Oxidation of lipids and pigments in fat-containing foods results in undesirable flavors and formation of compounds which have adverse biological effects or discoloration. Also yum. It's gonna make it sick. Right, so hypothesis. What's a hypothesis then? A hypothesis is a testable and educated guess about an observation. So we started with a problem, right? My problem being that I wanted to preserve my fruits and vegetables to keep them from going bad while retaining optimal nutritional benefit and flavor. So my question is, what is the most effective method of preserving food that also retains the best nutritional content, right? Yes, this is what we want. My hypothesis is that canning food will be the most effective method for preserving my food. So the objectives of food preservation. Why do we preserve food? This has been around for a long time, since the ancient times when we were making the shift from being hunter-gatherers to being stationary, community-dwelling farmers. And the purpose of preservation came about to hinder the development of microbials such as bacteria and fungi to stop or slow down the spoilage of food so that it can be eaten all winter. It's to minimize the risk of foodborne illnesses because we don't want to die from the food that we eat, and the retaining of the flavors and nutrients for consumption because we also want to eat tasty food. So an experiment is a procedure to test a hypothesis. This can be in various forms, such as in measurements, in data collection, and in manipulating and responding variables in an experiment. This experiment will be based primarily on data collection through various search engines and comparing types of food preservation. So what we're looking at here is the risk factor of the food spoilage, the nutrient content retained, the time that it's good for after it's preserved, and comparing the general advantages and disadvantages of each one. So, what we're looking at in terms of food preservation is canning, freezing, and dehydrating in particular. There are others, but for the purpose of time and conciseness, I chose to just do 3. We're looking at the factors are the time is good for after it's processed and how likely it is to spoil, the overall nutritional content after processing, how tasty is it after it's been processed, and the general advantages and disadvantages. Alright, so the first method we're looking at is freezing. Freezing is the process of preserving food through lowering the temperatures. It does not kill the bacteria, yeast, and molds. It just prevents their multiplication when it's kept at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. When the food is thawed, the surviving organisms can then again multiply. We're looking at freezing. The advantages are it's a relatively quick process. You can process a bunch of food in a short amount of time. You can preserve your food for a pretty good amount of time. You can buy it in bulk when it's on sale and save money. And then if you blanch it prior to freezing it, it stops the enzyme activity and helps maintain the nutritional value in your foods. You can double your recipes, meal plan, create convenient food that don't contain chemicals, preservatives, excess salt or sugar. You have several advantages over canning. Freezer containers are cheaper than the cans, jars, and lids for canning process, and the blanching process eliminates less heat in your living space than the canning does, and it generally preserves the nutrients better than canning. Vitamins, some disadvantages are that vitamin B and C are lost in the freezing process. Antioxidants are also lost, but you do retain your vitamins A, E, carotenoids, fibers, minerals, proteins when you freeze. Freezer burn can affect the texture and flavor. Eating freezer burnt food is not too appetizing. Many vegetables and most of fruits, they lose their crispness when they're frozen, so even if you blanch it, you're still probably going to have mushy vegetables, which isn't awesome. Nobody likes mushy vegetables. And fruits you can really only use in like smoothies and stuff. Freezers are also expensive. They have to invest in one initially, which is a good couple $1,000 if you're going to get a decent sized freezer, and then you have to add the added cost of electricity in there. And it's not really ideal for off-grid living or any place where you might not have space or consistent power. If you do have a power outage, you can lose all your food, which would not be good. And it's not recommended for really too long, a year or less. And after that, you have more likelihood that you're going to be eating. So next is dehydration. Dehydration is the process of drawing out the moisture to inhibit the growth of. Right, so we're looking at dehydration. The advantages of dehydration is that if it's dried and stored properly, it can be kept pretty much indefinitely. The dried foods are extremely lightweight and can be moved easily, so this is great for camping, biking, hiking, running, anything that involves you moving and not wanting to carry heavy things. Drying foods can weigh as little as 10% of what the fresh food would make. There'd also be a great way to save foods that are bought in excess, or if you need to bring them to your bunker while you wait out the apocalypse. Dried foods are a sweet alternative to sugary treats, and herbs and vegetables can add flavors to otherwise boring foods. So you can dry your herbs and stick them in broth and make soups and things like that. Dried foods have more calories on a weight for weight basis because of their nutrient concentration. So some disadvantages: they don't taste quite as great as the fresh foods do. If their moisture is left over in the drying process or gets in there during storage, it can cause mold on the food, which isn't good. Overly dried fruits and vegetables can be super hard, and where it's pretty difficult to eat. It's just not fun. The dehydrated foods have all the water removed, so you got to be sure to increase your fluid intake when you are eating lots of dehydrated. Okay, so next we're going to look at canning. Canning is the process in which foods are placed in jars or cans and heated to a temperature that destroys microorganisms and inactivates the enzyme. Right, so we're looking at canning. Advantages is we talked about that the canning alters the food chemically, and it keeps the moisture in by changing the salinity levels, pH, and protects against microbes, bacteria, and mold. You can keep canned foods on the shelves for 1 to 2 years longer than you would be able to fresh foods. It's economical when you're using your own supply or locally grown produce, and properly canned foods stored in a cool, dry place will retain optimum quality for at least a year. However, if you store it next to a heater or in the sun or anywhere that's hot, it can degrade the food within a few weeks or months. So disadvantages: the glass jars can break, the seals can break, causing spoilage. If you don't can properly, this can be dangerous because if you are inadequate in your canning process, or you have poor sanitation, you can get Clostridium botulinum, which is known as botulism. So botulism is not good, and you can die from it, so we don't want that. Canned foods don't taste quite as good as fresh foods do. They have lower nutritional value than fresh food, and they can lose, according to the USDA, decreases some nutrients by a third to a half. So it's a pretty big deal. But once they're canned, they don't lose their nutrients, but more than 5%, 10% a year. It also requires a significant investment of time and equipment, and using it just once or twice a year might not be really often enough to justify that. The jars are heavy and bulky, and you have to have a place. Other honorable mentions of food preservation: we've got fermentating. which is fermentation is a good practice of food preservation. It actually uses the culture of good bacteria to preserve the food and contains many health benefits along with its preservation benefits. So that's good. Salting is more for meats than vegetables, but basically the saw draws out the moisture of the food to prevent microbial growth. Smoking is also for more meats than fruits and vegetables, and the wood used to smoke contains antimicrobial compounds that slow down the rancidification process. Pickling it prevents the growth of bacteria because of the acetic acid in the vinegar, and this also includes nutrients, vitamins, amino acids, and healthy bacteria. And so this is a study done at the Colorado State University Extension, and it looks at the three different ones, canning, freezing, and dehydrating, in regards to what the vitamin retention are. It doesn't give us numbers, which is a bummer, but we can see whether or not the nutrients are stable during that process. So here we're looking at vitamin A, E, C, thiamine, and riboflavin. A can actually increase due to heat processing and varies during freezing, but it does degrade during storage, and dehydration is somewhat retained under controlled methods. E, it varies and it's stable in freezing and dehydrating. We don't really know too much about. Vitamin C is reduced due to heat and oxidation, but it's stable once it's in storage. In freezing, if we blanch it, we're gonna lose the vitamin C, and in dehydration, it's not well preserved. Thiamine is sensitive to heat, but is stable upon freezing and dehydrating. Riboflavin loses a little bit in heat, but is stable in freezing and dehydrating. Right, so here we're looking at niacin, B6, folate, and B12. Niacin is stable with canning and dehydrating, but it gets lost in freezing. It's also water soluble, so it would be lost some in canning as well. B6, we have some loss in canning, some loss in freezing, and some loss but very stable in dehydrating. Folate, we've got some loss due to heat. We don't really have too much data with dehydrating, and in freezing, it degrades relatively quickly. You got to eat it within 3 months or 6 months, especially for green beans. So B12 is stable all the way around. Here we're looking at vitamin D, vitamin K, general minerals, polyphenols, phytonutrients, and fiber. Vitamin D is stable across the board. Vitamin K is stable across the board. Minerals are stable, but we got some loss in dehydration due to rehydration or blanching. But if you don't rehydrate it, then you should be fine. You have your polyphenols and phytonutrients are water soluble, so you can lose them in the canning process. But if you retain the liquid, you can keep them. And there's not too much data on dehydration, but it's relatively stable in freezing. Fiber is stable across the board. So my conclusions are that the amount of data that directly compares the different forms of preservation of fruits and vegetables is pretty limited and kind of difficult to find. Further testing would need to be done for more accurate results, specifically further testing in a controlled environment using all of those methods where you know it's coming from the same source every time. While canned foods are often regarded as less nutritious than fresh or frozen products, some research reveals that this isn't always true. In general, while canning often does lower the content of these water-soluble and thermally liable nutrients, storage and cooking of fresh and frozen vegetables can also significantly lower their nutritional content. So really, there's no absolute best method for preservation, and this is because the different varieties of fruits and vegetables react differently to the different preservation processes, which is pretty cool. Therefore, a combination of different methods would be necessary to optimize nutrient retention depending on what you are preserving. So my original hypothesis was that canning would be the most effective way. Is incorrect because you end up losing a pretty good amount of your nutrients during canning, especially if they're water soluble. So dehydration seems to be the most effective nutrient rich method of vegetable and fruit preservation overall. And again, we said we're looking at time, which it can be kept indefinitely or for many, many years if done properly, more so than freezing or canning. It is the least likely to spoil if processed correctly, whereas freezing, right, your freezer can go out or you can freezer burn and you can lose all your food, or with canning, if you don't do it right, you can get botulism, which we don't want. So the best overall percent of nutrient retention also goes to dehydration, and it has the added benefit of having the most caloric benefit per weight, and has the added advantage of lightweight storage. So, and it seems to retain the most flavor compared to freezing or canning, especially after long periods of time. So, conclusion will be that I will be soon purchasing a dehydrator for preserving my excess fruits and vegetables when they start to go bad. So, some final thoughts. I know in the beginning we talked about this problem kind of globally, the food waste problem globally, and the impact of preservation and the localization of food supply and the value that it would have on the food system, the influence on food waste, and sustainability are not within the current scope of this study. So more, research would be needed on that, and it's a pretty big problem to solve, to be honest. However, you can hypothesize, or I can hypothesize, that by creating and supporting local sources of food that can also be preserved for off-season consumption, it would decrease food waste significantly and globally, which is my long-term goal, is to be able to create a local supply and preserve food to be a part of that. Here are some sources through the various websites that I used. Most of them are for colleges and things, and there's some science articles as well.